No school today. Wait, let me rephrase that. No school if you're rich and can afford an education. But if you're poor, then you just help your family survive. Welcome to life in ancient Egypt. Now, imagine waking up before sunrise in a house made of mud bricks. The air is already warm and the only sound is the lazy roll of the Nile by outside your window. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking ancient Egyptians had a great work-life balance. Well, not so fast. Sure, their houses didn't have roofs, fans, or alarm clocks, but they also didn't have AC, refrigerators, or indoor plumbing. Plus, you couldn't just take a day off whenever you wanted. The entire Egyptian economy revolved around the Nile River's annual flood cycle, so your work depended on the whims of the river gods. And let's just say they weren't known for their reliability. Egyptians rose when the sun rose because their house didn't have a roof fan, and it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit by breakfast time. Their first task? Pray to Ra, the sun god, because without his daily journey across the sky, crops wouldn't grow and everyone would starve. So yeah, the day started with both gratitude and a healthy dose of fear. Breakfast wasn't fancy, but it was filling. Bread, onions, and beer. Yep, beer for breakfast. Now, you might think this was a strange choice, but Egyptian beer was nutritious, thick, and way safer than Nile water, which was basically a sewage system with boats. After breakfast, it was time for kids to, well, there was no school the way we know it. If your parents could afford to hire a tutor, maybe you learned to read and write. Otherwise, you were automatically enrolled in the Help the Family Survive Academy, your uniform, rags, your classroom, a field. Women started grinding grain or weaving linen while men prepped for the fields, workshops, or temple duties. Everyone hoped they would get summoned by some local scribe to collect taxes or for a little community service. Hauling stones for Pharaoh's latest ego project counted as community service. Also, building temples and pyramids, making sure the work was done on time and to Pharaoh's exact specifications was critical. The slightest delay or mistake could get you on the wrong side of an angry pharaoh, and trust me, you didn't want that. Egyptians toiled from the hottest hours of the day until sunset, taking breaks only for lunch and to avoid getting sunstroke. Dinner was a bit more varied, but still pretty simple. It might include more bread, veggies, fruit, cheese, beans, or lentils. Meat was rare. But they did eat fish from the Nile. After dinner, it was time to wind down. People gathered in public spaces to play games, chat, and socialize, since their homes didn't really offer much in the way of privacy or relaxation. Men played checkers, senet, or practiced archery. Women and children might have preferred hopscotch or throwing a ball. And once the temperature dropped below, let's say 80 degrees, people felt comfortable enough to sleep outside in the open air. They took turns keeping watch while others slept, since there was no police force to protect them from, the occasional crocodile or hyena that liked to snack on sleeping villagers. As for entertainment, they had storytelling, which was kind of like their TV. They also had music, dancing, bull wrestling, poetry slams, and even the occasional royal pig assassination. Ah yes, once a year, the Egyptians would pick one pig to assassinate, usually in the most brutal ways imaginable. They believed this ensured the pig god, whose name they never uttered, would bless them with plucky goodness. Also, it was a great distraction from the fact that they were living in a mud hut with 100 other people and the nearest indoor bathroom was a 20-minute walk away. So, yeah, life in ancient Egypt was pretty chill, but only if you were a pig. What did you do during the Great Recession? The one that started in 2007 and lasted until 2009? Oh, you were too young. What about you? Too young to remember when Oasis Records went bankrupt and Blockbuster closed down all its stores? Now we're talking. But that recession was nothing compared to the one that hit ancient Egypt around 2180 BC. For nearly 100 years, the Nile River was in a massive funk. Instead of flooding at its usual time and bringing much-needed water and silt to the fields, the river barely gave Egypt a trickle. Crops failed, people starved, and the economy went into the toilet. But even when things are bad, somebody's got it worse. So let's play a little game. Guess what sucks worse than being poor in a failing economy? Pause the video here if you want to make a guess. Being a farmer in general probably sucks. Yeah, being a farmer in ancient Egypt specifically really sucks. See, farmers in general have to deal with the elements, be at the mercy of Mother Nature, and live in constant fear of losing everything you own to a single late-season frost or an early heat wave. But at least modern farmers have the benefit of technology, right? They can buy seeds that resist pests or spray crops with pesticides, irrigate their fields with water from underground aquifers, or get that perfect mix of fertilizer. Ancient Egyptian farmers had none of these luxuries. Being a farmer in ancient Egypt meant living by the rhythm of the Nile. When it flooded, you waited. When it receded, you sprinted. Everything depended on that moody river and whether it felt generous that year. If it wasn't, well, there was always the option of moving somewhere else. Maybe try to convince a pharaoh to make you vizier and move into the palace. Or you could always sail up the Nile to the richest city in the world, but nobody wants to be a farmer. So, assuming you were stuck on a farm, your days would start before the sun rose. That's because you'd be trudging barefoot through muddy fields, planting wheat and barley or tending to flax that would eventually become linen. Your tools would be simple, wooden things like sickles and hoes, and you'd use them to work the fields from dawn till dusk under the relentless glare of the Egyptian sun. Your back hated you, your feet were blistered, and you wanted to scream, but complaining wouldn't help. There was always someone poorer ready to take your job. If you were lucky enough to own some animals, maybe a donkey or cow, you could use them to help with the labor. But if you didn't, well, you became the axe. That's right. You'd pull the plow. After that, you'd plant the seeds and then repeat this process until your soul left your body or the supervisor yelled lunch. Now, lunch wouldn't be anything fancy. It was more bread, more onions, and more beer. And yes, you heard that right. Workers drank beer. It was thick like porridge, but hey, it helped make the long, hot hours pass by faster. Also, if the pharaoh decided to build a temple in the next valley over, you'd be borrowed from your fields to work on it. So not only would you grow the grain that fed the people, you might also spend your afternoons lifting huge blocks of granite. Fun. But wait, you might be thinking, doesn't this sound kind of fun? I mean, being an Egyptian farmer sounds pretty chill. Well, hold on, we saved the worst for last. See, if the Nile wasn't giving you enough water, the fields would turn into a desert. Then you'd have to walk barefoot through the sand carrying a water skin on your back, searching for a new farm to work on. And if you found one, great. If not, well, then you'd have to look for another village to plunder. Just kidding. Unless you were a Hyksos and invading people who brought their own farming techniques and ideas to Egypt, around 1648 BC, they would either enslave the Egyptians or force them into harsh labor, like working in copper mines. Sometimes farmers were forced to live in the mountains and survive on meager rations while the Hyksos took over their farms. But at least they weren't around much longer than a decade. When the Egyptians kicked them out, the country descended once again into chaos. A series of foreign rulers known as the New Intermediate Period saw Egypt divided and in chaos. Local lords fought for power while the people suffered. Then came the 12th dynasty, which ushered in an era of peace and prosperity, but not for the farmers. During this time, pharaohs built huge complexes of temples and nomes, administrative districts. They accomplished this mostly by forcing peasants into a labor system that kept them from ever leaving the fields. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's just say that being an Egyptian farmer was pretty freaking terrible. Hey, don't forget to subscribe. Want to know what life was like as a servant in ancient Rome? Check out the series in the description below. It's no secret that the vast majority of the ancient world couldn't read. So if you needed something written down, you hired someone who could. Enter the scribe, the ancient equivalent of Tech Brothers. The thing is, though, they didn't build pyramids. They wrote on them. That's right. Writing was so sacred and complicated in ancient Egypt that scribes were untouchable. They were the only ones allowed to put pen to paper, papyrus, clay tablet, or whatever other writing surface was at hand. So what was it like to be a scribe in ancient Egypt? Let's find out. Good morning. Here at the start of another glorious day in ancient Egypt. The sun is shining, the Nile is flowing, and it's time for us to get to work. Now, don't get me wrong. Being a scribe was awesome. We didn't have to lift heavy stuff or get our hands dirty. Our job was to write things down. But that meant we had to wake up bright and early to do some light stretching. Because what would an ancient Egyptian scribe be without his perfectly round belly? After a quick breakfast of beer and bread, it was off to the temple or office to work our very important jobs. We spent our days carefully drawing pictures that stood for sounds, ideas, and even full words. We made countless copies of official documents, letters, books, and records for the government. Keeping everything shipshape and well documented, we were basically emoji-based algebra. And when I say emoji, I mean hieroglyphics. We recorded taxes, kept track of grain stores, wrote letters for people who could figure out how to form the right shapes with their squiggly writing reed. And we even documented births, deaths, marriages, and any other notable events that happened in the city. Plus, we were the ones who recorded who owed what to whom, just in case they forgot. A scribe's work was never done. Now, you may be thinking that our days were filled with action, and you wouldn't be wrong. Just kidding. Our days were pretty uneventful, actually. Most of the time, we spent hours bent over papyrus making copies of official documents. But that wasn't all we did. Oh, no. We also made sure that history unfolded according to plan. For example, every year when the taxman came around, we made sure that certain farmers owed a suspiciously specific amount of wheat. How convenient. And when temples were being built, we recorded the names of the workers who were putting them up. Just in case they started to crumble before completion, we could always blame it on one guy named Akhenaten, Amenhotep III, Thutmose IV. It wasn't personal, it was just business. Now, you may be wondering, how did we get away with all of that? Well, first of all, we were the only ones allowed to read and write, so we kind of had a monopoly on record keeping. Plus, we wore clean linen and didn't really smell, unlike the 99% of the population that worked in agriculture. We also had soft hands because we never did manual labor. That detail alone was enough to make commoners think we were divine, so messing with us would be like messing with the gods. Or at least that's what we told ourselves to justify our cushy lifestyle. Lunch was probably better than a farmer's, consisting of dates, honey, and nuts instead of the typical bread and beer, but that doesn't mean we didn't get tired. After all, sitting cross-legged for hours on end can be exhausting, but somebody had to do it. And since we were the only ones who could, it was up to us. At the end of the day, we were the middle managers of ancient Egypt, and not all middle managers are created equal. Some of us got really powerful and could advance in our careers by becoming court officials or even priests. Others of us stayed in our little offices copying documents until we retired. But no matter what path we took in life, one thing was for sure: our job was secure. After all, there weren't exactly a lot of jobs you could go into in the ancient world. I mean, everyone couldn't be a pharaoh. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more information about ancient Egypt and other historical civilizations. Did you know that ancient Egyptian women didn't need rescuing? Nah, they were way too busy for that. Egyptians kept things pretty simple when it came to clothing. Linen was the fabric of choice because linen is totally breathable. I mean, it's hot there, right? The women wore long flowing dresses that were really comfy, perfect for those hot desert days. And the men, well, they rocked a loincloth, basically a piece of linen around the waist, no pants needed. Now, let's talk about the headgear. Men sported a cool, close-fitting cap that looked a bit like a skull cap. It was practical, stylish, maybe a little bit itchy. And the women, they wore these beautiful long wigs that reached down to their ankles. These wigs were a status symbol, the longer the better. They were made from human hair, sheep's wool, or even plant fibers. And the wealthy ladies, they had it extra fabulous with wigs made from gold thread. Now, these wigs weren't just for looking good. They were also a way to protect their heads from the harsh sun and keep their hair out of their face while they were working. Speaking of working, let's clear up a common misconception. Ancient Egyptian women were not just homemakers. They were the backbone of society, managing households, grinding grain, fetching water, and making sure the kids didn't drown in the Nile River. Wait, why did they have to fetch water? Well, plumbing was not a thing back then. The mighty Nile provided water for everything: drinking, cooking, cleaning, you name it. The women would use jars and pots to collect water from the river and then carry it back home. It was a necessary chore, but hey, at least they had the pyramids to help carry the load. Just kidding. The Great Pyramids were built by slaves, most likely male slaves. Laundry was another all-female affair. The women would wash clothes by hand in the Nile River and then hang them up to dry. This was not only a great workout, but also a social event as women would gather together to gossip and catch up while they scrubbed those dirty linens. By the way, the Nile was also their fish tank, bathtub, and sometimes crocodile hangout too. Yeah, that's a whole other story. Women were also responsible for cooking, brewing beer, and tending to the gardens. They made bread in clay ovens, the ones that look like giant pizza ovens, and guess what? They used leftover bread to make beer by fermenting it with water and a little help from some yeast. It's like their version of bread and butter, except instead of butter, they used beer and hops. Now let's talk about their amazing skills as herbalists and midwives. Egyptian women knew the healing power of plants and herbs, and they used them for medicine and beauty treatments. They concocted creams, ointments, and perfumes using ingredients like frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon. Some women even specialized in making wigs and perfumes and sold their wares in shops around town. Yes, they were entrepreneurs. Marriage customs were a little different too. There were no complicated marriage papers or ceremonies. Once a man decided he wanted to marry a woman, he just took her to his home and introduced her to his family. It was more of a, hey, you're living here now, we're married kind of deal. And while women were expected to be faithful, there were no legal repercussions if they weren't. If a husband wanted a divorce, he had to take his wife back to her family. Women could also take their husbands to court if they felt the need. Some upper-class women even became priestesses or entertainers, playing music at banquets and performing rituals. They had a pretty cushy life, if you ask me. I mean, who wouldn't want to be an entertainer in ancient Egypt? Daily life for Egyptian women was not all picnics and parades, though. They faced their fair share of challenges, from dangerous animals to pesky thieves. But they tackled everything with their signature blend of practicality and style. After all, they were Egyptian women. They didn't need rescuing. They were too busy building a society. So the next time you think ancient Egyptian women were just about those fancy tombs and treasures, remember they were also rocking linen dresses and smoking hot looks while managing their households and outsmarting the patriarchy. Talk about fierce. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If you've ever visited an ancient Egyptian site like Giza or Luxor, you may have noticed something odd. Among the tourists taking selfies and tour guides hawking about ancient curses are a bunch of people who look just like you and me, except they're wearing hard hats and goggles and busy pointing at things and writing stuff down. The weird thing is we probably wouldn't have noticed them if we had unstumbled onto an archaeological dig, because these people are archaeologists. And for decades they've been excavating, exploring, and carefully recording the remnants of what might be history's greatest construction project. But while Egyptologists have been uncovering heaps of artifacts near pyramids for centuries, we only recently figured out who actually built them. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to answer the extraordinary. Who were the pyramid builders? Now, we know what you're thinking. It was obviously slaves, right? That's what everyone thinks. But trust us, that's not the whole story. You see, although there's no surviving written record of how pyramids were constructed, Egyptologists can study the physical remains of the pyramids themselves, as well as related structures like workers' villages and their tools. And this evidence tells us that pyramid building was a huge undertaking that required a massive workforce, specialized skills, and a lot of management. So it probably wasn't slaves. In fact, it looks like the pyramid builders were highly skilled laborers, organized in rotating crews of around 1,000 men each that would work on a single pyramid for about 3 years before moving on to the next project. And these workers were well fed too. Archaeologists have found evidence of large kitchens and dining halls where workers were served up fresh vegetables, fish from the Nile, as well as beer and wine. There was even a full-size bakery where workers could pick up their pay in bread, and this was on top of their wages in beer. Each worker could earn about 2 loaves of bread and a pint of beer per day. Not bad for an ancient Egyptian worker. These workers also had access to medical care, and when they died, they were buried with respect in small but well-crafted tombs with coffins and grave goods. In other words, none of the things you would expect if slavery was a thing. And the construction process itself seems to have been carefully planned out. Teams of stonecutters, carpenters, and masons worked under overseers to drag massive blocks of stone from the nearby quarries to the construction site. Once there, they built temporary ramps and pathways to move the blocks into place. And every stone was carefully fitted together with incredible precision. Meanwhile, other teams of artists decorated the interior walls with paintings of paradise, complete with lush vegetation, exotic animals, and happy pharaohs. Scribes kept careful track of everything that went into the pyramid, making detailed records of each block of stone, including where it came from and where it was placed. Finally, at the very top of the pyramid, a team of elite masons would finish the pyramid's iconic smooth surface, working with copper chisels and hand tools. This painstaking process took years, but the result was a gleaming monument that could reflect the sun and impress the entire ancient world. Of course, this kind of labor-intensive work wasn't without its risks. Injuries were common, and some workers likely died on the job. But even in death, they seem to have been treated with dignity. So does any of this sound like slavery? Because we're pretty sure it doesn't sound like slavery to us. Sure, building pyramids probably wasn't the best job in ancient Egypt. It was hot, hard, dangerous work. But at the end of a long day of chiseling eternity into limestone, the workers could look forward to relaxing by a fire, sipping beer and laughing at the idea that one day someone would claim aliens did it instead. For more about those wacky pyramid builders, check out the series on our website. Did you know that ancient Egyptian women didn't sit around waiting to be rescued? No, they were too busy managing the entire household while the men played with dirt and taxes. Mornings began with sweeping the house, grinding grain, and fetching water because plumbing was a myth. Then they had to keep the kids from falling into the Nile. Laundry was hand-washed in a river that also doubled as a bath, a fish tank, and a crocodile hangout. After that, it was cooking bread in a clay oven, and don't forget the beer. Yes, beer made from fermented bread, more bread. Women also tended to gardens, so there was always fresh produce for, well, more bread and beer. Women were herbalists, midwives, and sometimes business owners who ran their own weaving or perfume-making shops from home. While ancient Egypt was mostly an oral society, some women learned to read and write, and some even became priestesses or entertainers who played music at banquets and performed rituals. Now, marriage in Egypt wasn't like your typical Western wedding with the paperwork and all that jazz. It was more like, hey, you're living here now. We're married. Men and women could easily divorce, and women could even take their husbands to court. So basically, it was kind of like a live-in relationship with some legal benefits. But don't get any funny ideas. It wasn't all sunshine and roses. Women still had to deal with some serious issues like female infanticide, which was a thing back then. Also, women couldn't become pharaoh without a male co-regent. But hey, at least they had each other's backs. Female friendships were super important in ancient Egypt. The royal women supported each other through thick and thin, like when Queen Hatshepsut took the throne. She appointed her BFF, Senenmut, as her vizier, basically putting her bestie in charge of the entire country. Now that's what I call a power move. Egyptians believed that women were a little closer to the gods than men, which gave women a bit of extra power in the land of the pharaohs. See, Egyptians thought that women were a little closer to the gods than men, so they often depicted goddesses as female. Women were also the ones who made offerings to the gods and kept the temples clean, which gave them a lot of influence in religious matters. Plus, women could own property and manage their own affairs, which meant they could build up their own wealth and power. Some women even became wealthy landowners, while others worked as scribes or doctors. Talk about breaking the glass ceiling. Women in ancient Egypt took care of their appearance. They wore makeup, oils, and lots of eyeliner because nothing says divine protection like smoky eyes. Now, let's not forget the fashion. Egyptian women were all about that linen life. They wore floor-length dresses made of linen, which was a type of fabric made from the flax plant. The dresses were usually simple and elegant, perfect for a hot climate. They also wore jewelry made of gold, silver, and precious stones. And let's not forget the wigs. Egyptian women wore wigs made of human or animal hair. They used to shave their heads completely bald and then wear these elaborate wigs. So while history books often focus on the pharaohs, it was really the women of ancient Egypt who were the real engines behind daily survival. There you have it. Ancient Egyptian women were the OGs of multitasking, managing households, raising kids, making beer, keeping the economy running. They truly had it all. Now excuse me while I go binge watch some shows about powerful females throughout history. Because if they can do it, why can't I finish that show? What did kids do in ancient Egypt? It's time for answers. The good news is that ancient Egyptian kids had it pretty easy. The bad news is that once they were old enough to work, their lives kind of sucked. But let's start at the beginning. Like kids today, most ancient Egyptian kids ran around barefoot. They played with simple toys like clay dolls, balls, and animals carved from wood or bone. A toy boat might have been a kid's first introduction to the mighty Nile River, while a wooden chariot could take them on imaginary journeys across the desert. Older kids could test their skills with Senet, a board game that predates chess by more than a millennium. Based on what we can tell from the pieces and the rules, Senet may have had something to do with the afterlife. But it was probably just as fun and rage-inducing as any modern board game. Life wasn't all fun and games, though. Boys began learning their father's trade as early as age 12, whether that be farming, fishing, stone-cutting, or scribing. Girls could help out with housework, weaving, or child-rearing. But unlike today, there was no school for most kids. Most kids just learned their craft on the job. If you were elite, though, say the son of a pharaoh or a wealthy landowner, you might attend a school alongside your peers. There you'd learn everything from math and science to reading and writing in 3 different scripts. You'd also learn music, dancing, and storytelling, which would come in handy when you had to entertain yourself during your endless hours of leisure. Now, don't get us wrong, we don't envy the ancient elites, but we do envy their access to swimming pools. I mean, we love the beach as much as the next guy, but nothing beats lounging poolside with a cold beverage and a good book. Well, except maybe war, famine, and disease. Now we're just being negative. Let's go back to ancient Egypt, where a kid's life was full of music, dancing, and swimming in the Nile, even if the water was filled with crocodiles. At least those crocodiles wouldn't stop them from fishing, since fish was an important protein source for the ancient Egyptians. Plus, a fisherman's daughter could make up her own hours, unlike the scribes whose work was never done. Of course, all that swimming and fishing worked up an appetite. So while the ancient Egyptians ate mostly vegetarian meals of bread, vegetables, and fruit, they also enjoyed tasty snacks like dates, figs, and grapes. And when it was time for a real treat, like on a festival day, families would gather to eat, sing, and dance. Beer was a popular beverage for all ages. And kids would join their parents in praising the gods with flowers in their hair and joy in their hearts. But the thing about ancient Egypt is that life was short, really short. Most Egyptians didn't live past 40, so childhood ended quickly. That's not to say they didn't enjoy it while it lasted, though. Even if they were still learning to spell their own names, every kid knew that death was always around the corner. So amulets, tomb plans, and savings for a decent burial were part of everyday life. And here's the thing about preparing for your own death. It makes you think about what comes next. Ancient Egyptians believed that if you played your part in this life, the afterlife would reward you with free food, endless sunlight, and 0 taxes. So while other kids were learning about the world, ancient Egyptian kids were learning how to get into heaven. We'll let you decide which is more important. Thanks for watching. Hey, like the video. If you want to see more content like this, click the link in the description below to subscribe to our channel.